I returned home late in the evening. Tired from a long flight and exhausted mood, I only talked about seeing my family, hugging my wife and spending time with my children. However, when I arrived at the house, I was alarmed by the fact that the light in the attic was on. This was unusual, as we rarely use the attic. I turned off the car engine and turned it on quietly, trying not to make any noise. The windows of the house were dark, except for the attic. Quietly, opening the front door with the key, I went inside. There was silence in the house, only the slight noise of the air conditioner could be heard. I walked past the living room, where our family photographs hung on the wall, and headed towards the door leading to the attic. As I climbed the steps, the feeling of uneasiness intensified. Approaching the attic door, I noticed that it was slightly open. I pushed her and entered. What I saw shocked me to the core. In the room, there was a large, beautifully made bed, completely new. There were drawings by our children on the walls, and on the nightstand there were several cards with the inscription, "We love you, Uncle Andre," signed by my children. My heart sank, and thousands of thoughts raced through my head. I sat on the edge of the bed, unable to see what I saw. Thoughts were confused. The mind refused to perceive reality. Suddenly it became clear to me. The wife with whom I lived for so many years opened up to me with some Uncle Andre. And our children were in this treatment. I paid close attention and began to collect my thoughts. Tears came to my eyes, but I held back. Anger began to fill me, but I decided to act calmly. I stood up and with shaking hands began to collect my things. I knew I would need to go up and get the kids and discuss their situation, but first I had to calm down and think things through. As I walked down the stairs, I looked back at the attic again. Now I associated this place with betrayal and pain. I closed the door behind me and slowly walked out of the house. A plan of action was already forming in my head, and I understood that this was only the beginning of a long and difficult path to restoring my life and regaining the trust of my children. Stepping outside, I opened up the fresh air and headed to my car. Thoughts about places and how to act correctly in this situation are spinning in my head. I knew that my life would never be the same, but I was ready to fight for my happiness and the happiness of my children. When I returned home, I could not calm down. Thoughts about what I saw in the attic haunted me. Deciding that I needed to get to the bottom of this, I sat down at the computer and began looking through photos on our family laptop. Among the many pictures from family holidays and trips, I came across a folder labeled Attic. My heart started beating faster again. I opened the folder and saw photographs that my wife apparently took recently. The pictures showed that same new bed, a room decorated with love and attention. In one of the frames, there was that same Uncle Andre, playing with our children. His face seemed vaguely familiar to me, but I couldn't remember how I knew him. I started looking through the photos further and came across a few videos. In one of them, children congratulated Uncle Andre on his birthday. In another, his wife is with him, preparing dinner in the kitchen. All this was filmed in our house. Unbearable pain and anger overwhelmed me. Unable to bear it, I decided to call my wife. With shaking hands, I dialed her number. She answered from the first ring. Her voice was calm and even joyful. "Hello, dear. How are you? I heard on the phone. We need to talk." "Now," I answered, barely containing my anger. "What are you talking about?" "I'm at work now. Can I call you back later?" "No." "Come home immediately," I insisted. She was silent for a few seconds, then said, "Okay, I'll be there in an hour." After hanging up the phone, I began to prepare for the conversation. All these years that we were together, I believed in her loyalty and devotion. And now everything collapsed in an instant. I knew I had to remain cool and rational in order to figure things out and make the right decision. When my wife returned home, I was already waiting for her in the living room. She came in with a slight smile, but when she saw my face, she immediately realized that something was wrong. "What's happened?" she asked, looking at me worriedly. "Sit down," I said, pointing to the sofa. She complied, clearly nervous. I found photos and videos. "Who is Uncle Andre?" I asked, trying not to shout. Her face turned pale and she lowered her eyes. I can explain everything," she began. Yes, I want to hear it. And why do our children call him Uncle Andre? I continued. She took a deep breath and began her story. It turned out that Uncle Andre was her old friend, whom she began dating even before our wedding. They kept in touch. She took a deep breath and began her story. It turned out that Uncle Andre was her old friend, whom she began dating even before our wedding. They kept in touch all this time, and when I was on business trips, he came to our house. The children knew him as a close family friend and became accustomed to his presence. Why didn't you tell me about this earlier? Why did you betray me like this? I asked, feeling tears welling up in my eyes. I was afraid that you will understand. You were always so busy with work? She made excuses, but her words sounded empty. That's no excuse, I said, standing up. You betrayed our trust. You betrayed me and our children. She cried, but I could no longer feel sorry for her. Everything inside me was seething with pain and anger. I knew that I could no longer trust her, and that our lives would never be the same. I left the house, leaving her crying on the sofa, and went into the night to think about everything that had happened. After I left the house, it took me a while to process everything that had happened. I walked the streets at night until I found a bar, where I sat at a table in the corner and ordered a double whiskey. My thoughts vacillated between anger and despair. At some point, I decided that I couldn't just leave everything as it was. I had to do something to convey to her all the pain she caused me. A few hours later, when the whiskey had softened the rough edges of my thoughts, I decided to return home. Trying not to make any noise, I quietly opened the door and entered the house. The wife was sleeping on the sofa in the living room. Her face was tear-stained and tired. I paused for a moment, watching her, and suddenly an idea came to mind. I had to leave her a surprise so she would understand that her actions had consequences. I went to the attic where I discovered a hidden camera. I knew there had to be more cameras in our house, given how secretive it was. I found several more recordings in which she and Uncle Andre were together. This further strengthened my decision to act. In the kitchen, I found a large, empty cardboard box. Having decided that this would be the basis for my surprise, I filled it with things that reminded us of our best moments. Photographs, gifts, souvenirs from our travels. All this that once mattered to us now seemed like a lie. Then I wrote a letter, putting all my pain and disappointment into it. You betrayed our trust and destroyed our family. These things were reminders of our happy times, but now they seem like lies. You must realize that your betrayal will not come without consequences. I placed the letter on top of the drawer and closed it. Picking it up, I could hardly drag the box into the living room and leave it in front of my sleeping wife. Now all she had to do was wait for her to wake up and see this surprise. I decided not to stay at home and went outside again. The night was dark and cold, and I knew that I had a long road ahead of me to restore my world. When I returned home in the morning, she was already awake. Her face was pale, her eyes were red from crying. She was holding my letter in her hands, and the things from the box were scattered on the floor. "Did you find my surprise?" I asked, watching her reaction. "How could you—" she began, but I interrupted her. "This is just the beginning. You must understand that your actions have consequences. I can't trust you anymore, and this is what you deserve." She cried again, but now I didn't feel a bit of pity. I knew that this was only the first step towards my revenge. Her betrayal would have serious consequences, and I was going to make sure she realized that. I understood that rage and disappointment alone were not enough to understand the current situation. I needed more information. I knew that I needed to find answers to my questions in order to finally understand what happened between my wife and her lover. So I decided to do my own research. The first thing I did was check her phone, which she left on the kitchen table. Unread messages and missed calls were displayed on the screen. Scrolling through my contact list, I found a number that made me suspicious. This number belonged to Uncle Andre. I wrote it down on a piece of paper so that I could later find out who he was and why the children called him so affectionately. The next step was to go to the computer that was in the office. I knew that my wife often used this computer for work and communication. After logging into her account, I began looking through my browser history and conversations on social networks. A few minutes of searching led me to numerous messages and photographs that confirmed her infidelity. They shared plans for the future, discussed meetings, and openly confessed their love to each other. My heart sank in pain, but I knew that I needed to move on. One of the messages included a link to an email address, which I immediately opened. It was their personal sanctuary where they shared their innermost thoughts. I found letters in which they planned meetings, discussed my business trips, and even took photographs together that were never intended for my eyes. Then I discovered a folder with photos and videos. Opening it, I saw pictures taken in our home, in the very places that should have been sacred to our family. In the video, they were enjoying each other's company, laughing and hugging as if I never existed. These discoveries were like stabs in the heart, but I couldn't stop. I continued searching, and my efforts were successful. In one of the letters, I found the address where they met. It was a small apartment in the suburbs that I didn't even know existed. I wrote down the address and decided the next step would be to check the place out. After collecting all the evidence, I felt anger growing inside me. But along with the anger came the realization that I needed to act carefully and thoughtfully. I didn't want to make hasty decisions that could only make the situation worse. I lay awake that night, contemplating my next move. I needed to make sure that my actions would have consequences for her, so that she would feel all the pain that she caused me. And that was just the beginning of my plan. The next day, I went to the apartment whose address I found in the letters. I stood in front of the door, thinking about what could have happened behind these walls. The wait was unbearable, but I knew I had to go in. Plucking up my courage, I rang the doorbell and prepared to face the truth. When the door opened, I saw an unfamiliar man in front of me. His face expressed surprise, and a shadow of fear flashed in his eyes. I realized that this was the same Uncle André. Without further ado, I entered the apartment, intending to get answers to all my questions. Having collected all the evidence and calmed down a little, I realized that it was time to talk to the children. They were the most important people in my life, and I couldn't let them suffer because of this situation. I knew the conversation would be difficult, but it was necessary. They deserved the truth, and I had an obligation to tell it. Sitting in the living room, I called them both. The children entered the room with questioning glances. I felt that something was wrong. I invited them to sit next to me on the sofa and began to talk. "My dears, we need to talk about something very important. I know it will be difficult, but I want you to know the truth. Mom and I are going through a difficult period." They looked at me silently, waiting for me to continue. I took each of them by the hand to let them feel my support. I was on a business trip, and when I returned, I learned something unpleasant. You may have noticed that we have new things in our attic. I saw a bed there and postcards that you signed for Uncle André. The eldest son frowned, and the youngest daughter looked confused. They couldn't understand what was happening. The evening of the next day came, and Irina returned home later than usual. I already knew the reason for her lateness, but decided not to show it. A storm was raging inside me, but I tried to remain calm. I needed to prepare everything for a final solution to this situation. When the children went to bed, I invited Irina to spend the evening together. She agreed, although I noticed a slight worry in her eyes. We sat down on the sofa, turned on the TV, and started watching a movie. But my thoughts were far from the screen. After a while, when Irina was distracted by her phone, I pretended to remember something in the attic. I told her that I needed to check something and asked her to help me. Irina was surprised, but did not object. We went up to the attic, and I noticed her face change when she saw the camera. "What is this?" she asked, trying to remain calm, but I saw her hands tremble. "It's a camera," I answered coldly. "And she wrote down everything that happened here in recent days." Irina turned pale. She tried to say something, but I interrupted her. "I saw everything, Irina. I saw how you brought André here, how you laughed and planned the future together. You destroyed our family for him." She tried to justify herself, but I didn't want to listen. At that moment, I knew I had to take the next step. I took my phone out of my pocket and showed her the recording. Irina froze, looking at the screen, and tears flowed down her cheeks. Why? I asked, unable to contain my anger. Why did you do this? We were happy. We had plans. Children. She began, but her voice was shaking. I don't know. It all started by accident. I felt lonely, and Andre was nearby. Lonely? I asked again, feeling how everything inside me was shrinking. Lonely? And what about me? What about our children? You were only thinking about yourself. She tried to approach me, but I stepped back. Don't come closer, I said. Everything is over. I can't forgive you for this. Irina cried, but I was adamant. I returned to the house, leaving her in the attic. I needed to think about what to do next. I sat in the kitchen, trying to calm down. My head was racing with thoughts about how best to protect my children and myself. After some time, Irina came down from the attic. She came to me, trying to explain her actions, but I did not want to hear her apology. Everything was clear. Our trust was destroyed, and I saw no way back. Tomorrow, you will pack your things and leave, I said firmly. I don't want to see you in this house. Irina nodded, realizing that there was no point in arguing. She went into the bedroom, and I stayed in the kitchen, thinking about all the events that had happened. This was a turning point in our lives, and I knew big changes were ahead. Several months have passed since that ill-fated day. Life has changed significantly. The children and I tried to get used to the new realities, although it was not easy. Irina left for another city, and we no longer communicated. Her betrayal left a deep mark, but time heals all wounds. At first, the children had a hard time being separated from their mother, but over time, they adapted. I tried to spend more time with them, support them, and help them cope with their emotions. We went through this difficult period together, and our connection only grew stronger. One of the first steps in a new life was remodeling the house. I decided to completely remodel the attic to get rid of all the memories associated with Irina and her betrayal. The kids and I turned it into a cozy playroom where they could hang out and forget about the past. One day I decided to spend the evening with the children in the park. We rode bikes, ate ice cream, and laughed. It was what we all needed: simple, carefree time together. Seeing their smiles, I knew we were moving in the right direction. After the park, we returned home and I decided to cook dinner. While I was cooking, the children were watching TV. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. I went to open it and was surprised to see Natalia, an old family friend, on the doorstep. "Hello," she said with a smile. "I was just passing by and decided to come in." We invited her to dinner, and the evening passed in a warm and friendly atmosphere. The children were happy to meet, and I realized that I was not alone in this world. The support of friends and loved ones was incredibly important. Natalia began to visit us often. She helped with the children, brought pies, and was just there. With her help, I began to look at life in a new way. We began to communicate more, and soon I realized that I was experiencing feelings for her that I had not experienced for a long time. A few more months passed, and our relationship with Natalia became serious. The children adored her, and she treated them as if they were her own. Our new family was starting to take shape, and I was grateful for it. End. The moral of the story is, even in the darkest tea,